Welcome everyone to this Brochure Foundation Meetup. I'm Sally Davies, the editor of Eon magazine, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this panel of distinguished speakers discussing the practice of surrogacy today with a particular focus on its implications for children. So as many of you will be aware, surrogacy is the practice of allowing a person to gestate and, all being well, give birth to a child with the intention that someone else will become the intended parent. It's a polarizing and thorny phenomenon, to say the least. While some view surrogacy as on a continuum with human trafficking and exploitation, others see it as an important means for gestating people to gain autonomy and independence. What makes surrogacy even more complex is the network of transnational actors involved, from private agencies to government regulators, from donors of biological material to intended parents, and of course from surrogates themselves and to the children born of surrogacy. Regardless, surrogacy is happening around the world right now, and as the plight of surrogates in Ukraine has made abundantly clear, is urgently necessary. It's urgently necessary for us to pay attention to it. So we're going to talk for about an hour today, and I'm just going to start by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And after that, Geraldine and Sharon will give brief presentations, and then we'll begin the discussion. So before that happens, I'd really love to encourage those of you dialing in to share a little bit about yourselves if you feel comfortable, including what your background is, what's brought you to this meetup today, and any questions or subjects that you'd like the panelists to touch upon. So with that in mind, let's kick off, and let's just start with some brief introductions. So just in order of those on my screen, Sharon, if you'd just like to introduce yourself. Oh, you're on mute, Sharon. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and a family psychotherapist, trained between England and America. And I began working in the field of donor conception for both research and clinical work about 20 years ago. And that has inevitably begun to include surrogacy, which is on the increase in the UK. And we know that because the applications for parental orders have increased enormously over the last 10 years or so. So I will be bringing that perspective.
Thank you, Sharon. Mia.
Hi, my name is Mia Dumbach, and I'm the Executive Director of Child Identity Protection. I'm a newcomer to the field of surrogacy, but working mostly in the United Nations field and trying to bring up the issues linked to children with the Committee on the Rights of the Child with UNICEF and with Child Identity Protection and UNICEF. We launched just 2 months ago a briefing note on the issue of surrogacy, which for us summarizes most of the issues related to children that can come up in a surrogacy arrangement.
Thank you so much. And Geraldine.
Yes, thank you, Sally. Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Geraldine Mathieu, and I am a professor of family law and youth law at the University of Namur. Namur is a small town. It's the capital of Wallonia in Belgium. So as you can hear, my English is far from perfect, so I will do my best today, but I apologize for my French accent in advance. Thank you. Oh, and no. I forgot to say why I'm interested in this subject, because I made my doctoral thesis on the subject of the right of the child to know his or her origins in different contexts, but also in the context of surrogacy.
Thank you, Geraldine, and no apologies necessary, I'm sure. Let's kick off with your presentation so we can hear a little bit more about your focus in this area and its implications for the rights of the child.
Okay. Can you see the presentation? Okay, thank you so much. So I'm very happy to be here today as an alumni of the foundation, because as you can see on this picture, look, I have been lucky enough to be welcome in this idyllic setting for 7 years, and I have excellent memories of it. And I also stayed at the foundation at the same time as Dr. Sharon Petal. Do you remember, Sharon? That's you. So I am delighted to see you again today at this brochure meetup on surrogate motherhood and children's rights. So I have chosen to talk to you about the child's right to identity. So the child's right to the preservation of his or her identity in the context of surrogate motherhood covers, in my opinion, two components. You have on the one hand the right to know his or her origins and therefore his or her birth parents, more particularly the woman who carried and gave birth to him or her, but also, where applicable, the identity of the gamete donor. On the other hand, and at the same time, there is also the right of the child to be quickly reunited with his or her intended parents. So one of the major challenges of regulating surrogate motherhood is therefore to reconcile these two fundamental rights of the child born from such a practice. So let us start by talking about the right of the child to know his or her origins. This fundamental right of the child is reflected in several provisions of the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 7, which establishes the right of the child to know his or her parents as far as possible. Article 8, which enshrines the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, without forgetting Article 3, which transcends all the rights of the child and requires all decision-making authorities to take into account the best interest of the child as a primary consideration. This consideration of the best interest of the child requires, at the very least, respect for the rights recognized by the Convention. It's important to note that the Committee on the Rights of the Child has had occasion to point out in its concluding observation on several states that the right of a child to know his or her parents is denied by state parties that allow anonymous childbirth, baby boxes, secrecy of adoption, but also anonymity of gamete or embryo donation. For example, in its latest concluding observations on Belgium in February 2019, the committee asked Belgium to review its legislation to consider whether children born through medically assisted reproduction should have access to information about their origin. Because my country's legislation continues to provide for the anonymity of gamete and embryo donation, which is, as far as my concern, totally unacceptable in terms of the fundamental rights of the child. But the child's right to know his or her origins is also protected by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which enshrines the right of every person, so adult or minor, to respect for his or her private life. And the European Court of Human Rights consider in this respect that respect for private life protects the right to identity and personal fulfillment. For the court, the right to identity is even part of the hardcore of the right to respect for private life, in that it's an essential condition of the right to autonomy and personal development. The court thus described as vital the interest of the child, even as an adult, in obtaining the information necessary to discover the truth about an important aspect of his or her personal identity, including the identity of his or her parents. Respect for private lives requires, in the court's view, that a person be able to access information, enabling him or her to establish some of the roots of his or her history. Although the court has not yet expressly ruled on the issue of gamete donor anonymity, this will soon be the case because two applications against France are currently pending before the Strasbourg court. The right to know one's origins is certainly not an absolute right and must therefore be balanced against the rights of the other parties involved, mainly those of the donor and the parents. While for a long time, the balance between the different rights involved was mostly in favor of the donor and the preservation of his or her privacy through anonymity, the balance is now tending to shift in favor of the children born from the donation. So the current trend in Europe is clearly towards lifting donor anonymity in the name of the child's right to access his or her personal origins. Thus, in a resolution of 12 April 2019, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe asked the Committee of Ministers to make recommendations to the Member States in order to monitor this development. It thus recommends that anonymity be waived for all future sperm and egg donation with disclosure of the donor's identity to the child at his or her 16th or 18th birthday, without, it's important, any legal consequences in terms of filiation and without retroactivity, unless the donor wishes otherwise or for medical reasons. It also suggests that a national register of donors and children conceived by the nation be set up in each Council of Europe member states that allows medically assisted reproduction with donation in order to facilitate the exchange of information. While this recommendation is not binding on states, it's based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. It's therefore essential that any instrument for the legal regulation of surrogate motherhood takes into account the fundamental right of the child to know his or her origins. But on the other hand, the child's right to preservation of his or her identity also implies that he or she should not remain in a parentage vacuum and that he or she would be quickly reattached to his or her intended parents. At the international level, it can be seen that in the states that have adopted legislation on surrogate motherhood, there are two trends. On the one hand, there are countries that make the intended parents the only legal parents at birth. Immediately, their names are registered in the birth certificate with or without an upstream control process. And then there are countries where at birth, the surrogate mother will be declared as the child's legal mother. And then in a second stage, there is a procedure for transferring parental rights to the intended parents. This is obviously more respectful of the child's right to know his or her origins, as the child will be then able to access, through the consultation of his or her birth certificate, at least the identity of the woman who gave birth to him or her. The European Court of Human Rights has already had the opportunity to deliver several judgments on this issue, as well as an advisory opinion in April 2019. While the Strasbourg Court does not require states parties to legislate on surrogate motherhood, because it's a matter of their sovereignty and margin of appreciation, it does oblige them to recognize in some form the parent-child's relationship established abroad with regard to the biological father and the intended mother in the name of the best interest of the child, which implies having regard to the protection of the child's right to respect for his or her private life and the consequent right to be able to establish the substance of his or her identity, including parentage. Thus, its case law shows that when a child born of surrogate motherhood abroad is born from the gametes of the intended father, the right to respect for the child's private life requires states to recognize the parent-child relationship with regard to the father of the child, but also with regard to the intended mother, whether or not she is the genetic mother. But the choice of means to be implemented to allow the recognition of the child-parent relationships falls within the margin of appreciation of states, in view of the absence of a European consensus on the matter. It may be a question of the immediate transcription of the birth certificate mentioning the intended parents as legal parents, or of adoption, provided that the recognition of the parent-child relationship can effectively be achieved with the required speed. It should also be noted that in the absence of a biological link between both intended parents and the child, the court does not require the recognition of parentage links. So, in conclusion, whatever the choices made in domestic law regarding to the acceptance, tolerance, or refusal of surrogate motherhood, states must face the problems linked to the inevitable internationalization of this process. And in the absence of specific international provisions dealing with the cross-border aspects of surrogate motherhood, magistrates, as well as municipal and consular officials, faced with the realities, will have to try to solve the problems by applying their rules of private international law. One can only approve the case law of the Strasbourg Court, which intends to preserve, whatever the circumstances of the birth of a child, his or her right to respect for private life, including the right to identity. Taking into account the best interests of the child as a primary consideration implies that the child should not be disadvantaged by the fact that he or she has been born as a result of surrogate motherhood. The child's right to nationality and to preservation of his or her identity must certainly be respected in accordance with Article 7 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In the context of surrogate motherhood, it therefore seems to us that the child's right to respect for his or her private life, which implies preserving both his or her right to respect for his or her identity, and to the establishment of filiation links with his or her intended parents, and his or her right to knowledge of his or her origins must be respected in all its components. So I thank you for your attention. I hope it was clear. And if you have any question, don't hesitate. Thank you very much. Look, my last dia. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. That was fascinating. I've got some questions arising from that, and we've got some very interesting questions coming from the attendees. But before we launch into the discussion in earnest, I'm going to invite Sharon to give a brief presentation, and then we can kick off the discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, bear with me for a moment while I manage this bit of the process. I seem to have lost my picture and the picture of anybody else, but can everybody see that? Hello? Oh gosh.
I can see you and hear you perfectly, Sharon.
Can you see the slide?
The slide, no.
Oh, hang on a minute. Oh, I'm so sorry. I really hate it when I do this. I think because I haven't done share screen. Apologies, everybody. Share screen. Are we there now?
Yes, that looks great.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to very much concentrate on the psychological perspective. And this will draw on research and the range of my clinical experiences, which, as I mentioned, have spanned more than 20 years and have included groups with children, therapeutic consultations with families, couples and individuals, and providing expert reports in court, such as complexities around applications for parental orders in England, Wales and parts of Ireland. There are differences in law in Ireland and in Scotland, and where couples are separating or divorcing, and there are questions of residence and contact, but surrogacy and or donor conception have been part of that. And some of the things that I think would be very interesting to discuss and to hear from people who are listening to this, and I'm sure will have much to contribute, is what are the differences when one is thinking about individual families in relation to a number of factors, such as the baby's genetic link, if there is one, and with whom. So whether it's traditional surrogacy using the surrogate's own egg, or a more complex arrangement using the couple's own gametes or donor egg or sperm, or a donated embryo. And what's the difference, or what are the differences and factors impacting on a child later on, whether it's altruistic or commercial surrogacy, whether donors are anonymous or identifiable, whether their parents had much preparation and the quality of what they did have, and whether it's in-country or international. I'm just going to briefly mention two recent reviews because they are both really well written and a really good way for people who might want to quickly catch up with quite extensive research in the area. And what I really appreciated about both of them is that they have a good capacity to be critical. So both did quite considerable literature searches. Interesting that the one by Sonderstrom and Tiller covered almost 2,000 articles, but only 55 met the criteria for being of good enough research standard. And they take a different point of view. The Simopoulou paper is really a paper which looks at the various medical procedures and the potential of those impacting on a child subsequently. And it's not clear in many situations whether the treatment is taking place upon a surrogate or upon a woman who's going to give birth to the child herself. In the Sonderstrom and Tiller review, there was a lot about medical outcomes and how the perinatal outcomes are comparable to standard IVF with egg donation. But most important, I'm wanting to highlight the psychological follow-up on children. And most of the studies have actually taken place in the UK, and find at 10 years old no major psychological difficulties or differences between surrogacy-born children and those born through other kinds of art-assisted reproductive technology. But when they were 7, they did find a higher level of adjustment problems in the surrogacy-born children. Now, this is a relatively small sample study, and that most of the children were aware of their conception story, and 14 out of the 42 had met the surrogate in the past year. Generally, psychological well-being of children is found to be good. However, a Brazilian study, which covered more than 100 families, found some delays in growth and motor development and speech in preschool children, which tailed off as they got older. So some of the questions raised by each of those reviews were that questioning whether the development of fetal consciousness might be affected by how the surrogate feels about carrying, and my question is whether that differs, whether they're carrying a child to whom they're genetically connected or not. The paper also recognised that it can be a very complicated process involving many people, donors, commissioning parents, etc., and found that reported on a paper which suggests that, in a small sample at least, surrogacy-born children, that the relationship with their mother, their social legal mother, was even more positive than found in naturally conceived children, and there were positive qualities found in the families with surrogacy born children, which included those led by same-sex couples. In the other paper, no serious psychopathology in surrogates, but the risk of postnatal depression was up to 1 in 20%. Now, some UK studies of surrogates have shown that a third had some or moderate difficulties handing over the child, and 6% reported negative feelings about having been a surrogate and relinquishing their child about a year later. There was often contact with families which was generally harmonious and regular, but the frequency of contact tended to decrease over time. They found no negative impact on the surrogate's own children, and many intended parents had shared with their child about their origins or stated the intention to do so. And I'm sure, as many of you will recognise, the intention is very different from actually doing. So both studies both reviews pointed to the inadequacy of research, really, called for larger studies reporting on surrogacy and comparing surrogacy management to routine IVF, with questions about whether surrogates might be handled differently and possibly suboptimally, particularly in relation to a number of things such as multiple embryo replacement and the use of fetal reduction. The other study pointed out serious methodological limitations in most studies, often a very small sample size, and really advised caution in interpreting the data. And then, this is 5 years ago, there were not studies which looked particularly at issues around cross-border surrogacy or of gay fathers who had children using surrogacy. So I'm certainly not going to read out the whole of this slide, but I wanted to raise the question about epigenetics, because over the last few decades, we've really been learning that experience, not only DNA, plays a large role in how we develop, and that includes our experience in the womb. So how does the surrogate's health and uterine environment impact on gene expression? We know that it will have an impact on babies if the mother or the carrying woman has a poor diet. The hormonal environment of the woman is likely to have a role in determining the baby's later functioning, particularly around immune systems, and the carrying mother's emotional state, such as stress, anxiety, and depression, will affect various hormone levels in the baby because those cross the placental barrier. So there is not only an emotional connection, potentially, but a biological bond of a sort between the surrogate and the developing baby. So what's the child's experience? So really important to think about very early fetal development, because the tissues associated with the senses are developed to a great extent before birth. Smell is very well developed. The working parts of our inner ear are almost adult size by the time we're born. So what's the child's experience immediately after birth? How long? Is it seconds? Is it minutes? Are they with the gestational mother or with the surrogate? The woman whose smell and whose voice they will have come to recognize and be familiar with. And what happens in the handover? Now, this is a sculpture by Louise Bourgeois, which I saw recently at her retrospective in London. And it struck me as a really clear metaphor for the world of a baby. And that for the baby, whoever the intending parents, whatever the donated gametes or not, this woman within whom they have developed is their entire world. And I think it's something that we need to recognize and really honor. So how much contact is there between the surrogate and the intending commissioning parents? Before the agreement is made, before the pregnancy actually takes place, during the pregnancy, or before conception takes place, at the birth and immediately afterwards, and what plans are there, if any, for a future relationship? And that, in my experience, can vary from parents virtually not meeting the surrogate and having absolutely no contact with her thereafter, and families where they are much more inclusive of the surrogate, her role and future connection with their family. So do parents tell or not? There is an enormous potential for secrets around donor conception and surrogacy, and there's been a lot of writing on secrets and their impact. So they are inherently embedded in a relationship context. One has to think about who holds the secret, who the information is kept from or shared with, and that there are different types of secrets, some which are sweet, and some which are essential when we create intimacy with somebody and have private private jokes, private information which isn't shared with other people. Others are dangerous and require swift action to create safety, for example, in situations such as abuse. And others are deemed as toxic, with the potential to affect relationships, to impact on alliances and communication within families and beyond families, and impact on parental well-being. And as you read through that, I'd like you to think about how you would classify a secret about biological parentage. So it is also possible to share a conception story, and many families have been doing this, particularly those using donated gametes, for many years. Within the UK, there is a parent-led charity called the Donor Conception Network, which offers preparation workshops for parents, helps them get used to the language that they need to use. There are now books for young children relevant to different types of donation, with or without surrogacy, and various family forms. The research shows very clearly that children told of their donor conception origins before they're 8 manage this much better than being told later. Families can benefit from support from other families who are a bit further ahead of them in terms of their family building, and when they include them in their social network. Within something like the Donor Conception Network, I have developed and run children's groups for something like 16 years, I think now, and that provides positive experience for children to spend time with other children who have similar stories, and they're able to share and ask questions. So there are organisations which may enable parents to feel less alone if they're struggling with sharing their story or with the questions that children come up with. So a wry smile, because obviously if you're going to tell a child or an adult about their conception and or their parentage being rather different, the timing is really important. This is a funny way of getting that across. And just towards the end, we know that unplanned or late revelations can be extremely painful for everybody involved. The donor conceived or surrogacy born young person or adult, their parents, and potentially now with DNA tracing to donors and their families who may not have been aware that a relative has donated. For the individual, it can lead to a serious fracturing of their sense of identity and impact on their sense of trust, and create feelings of betrayal between them and the people that they have grown up with as parents, but who have not been honest with them. And it may need, or people may benefit from, individual or family therapy to help find a way forward. So I would also welcome questions and connection with participants and the other panelists. I'm just trying to get out of that. I think I've managed.
I think we can still see your screen there, Sharon.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
A huge impediment.
I'll find my way. I'm really sorry. I thought I'd stopped sharing. When it says new pause share. Oh no, hang on, I found the stop share. There we
go. There we go.
Done it.
Thank you very much for that fascinating and in-depth presentation, which has raised lots of questions for me, as I'm sure it has for the participants and panelists. We have half an hour, or just under half an hour left for the conversation. Before we launch into that, Mia, I just wanted to ask if you had any questions or comments that arose from either Geraldine or Sharon's presentation that you'd like to bring to the fore.
Yeah, there are just a few thoughts that are roaming around in my mind. I think when you introduced why surrogacy is such a complex issue, I think another reason why it's so complex is when it deals with money and the potential to commodify human beings. I think that that's also an issue that comes up. And in terms of something that Geraldine spoke about, which I fully supported her presentation in terms of the right to know one's origins, what I think is another issue that keeps coming up, especially which came up in Ukraine, is now these children are born. We want to make sure that they have legal parents, but should the right to have a legal parent trump other rights? So the other rights being For example, the right not to be sold, the right to have nationality, the right to non-discrimination, because as we know in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, all rights are equal. And what I'm seeing around the world is this movement to make sure that children have legal parentage, very, very important, but it trumps other rights. And I don't think that that's necessarily the right approach. And I think that what Sharon's been talking about is really important, is a lot of it has to happen in the preparation. Because if we prepare the intending parents well about the importance of sharing this information, I think that surrogacy can work really well. And the arrangements can be very beneficial to children, but we need to make sure that they're occurring in a way that respects all their rights, and not just children's rights, women's rights, all the other rights of all the actors that are involved.
Thank you. Well, look, that touches on a question that arose for me coming out of Geraldine's presentation. Geraldine, I was very interested to hear your characterization of these two trends. On the one hand, you have countries where the commissioning parents, if you will, or the intended parents are recognized immediately upon the birth of the child as the parents. And then you have countries, on the other hand, who recognize the birthing person as the parent, or probably in most cases as the mother. And then parentage is transferred to the intended parents. So I'd love to hear from the panelists what they see as the pros and cons of those different regimes, because it seems to me, based on the landscape of rights that you've sketched, both of those scenarios create possible conflicts with other rights that children may possess. So I'm curious to know what the panelists think is an optimal arrangement, or what at least the benefits and drawbacks of those different frameworks might be.
Mia?
Yep, okay. I think that there are, for me, the question of the child having a legal parent at birth, that's very important. For me, the question is not that, but it's at what point do we transfer the legal parentage, and for what consideration or remuneration. If we're transferring it for some consideration or remuneration, then that under international law results in sale. So if I'm paying, let me bring it down to really, if the surrogate mother is only transferring her legal parentage because she's going to get money for it, then that is sale. But if she's transferring it for other reasons and not for the money, then that is not sale, and that can work. So I don't think it's a problem either way, whether it's the intending parents at birth or the surrogate mother. I think we have to leave it to each national country that will allow surrogacy to occur or not occur in their state, because that's going to be a really, I don't think there is any international law that says that it has to be the surrogate mother or it has to be the intending parents. But what we do know is that the transfer cannot be for remuneration or any other consideration.
Does that lead, oh, Sharon, sorry, go ahead. I think you're maybe muted. I think you're muted there, Sharon.
Yeah. Am I correct in thinking that in Israel there is a very different situation around surrogates caring for the baby for a limited amount of time?
Yep. In Israel, what they have is a commercial surrogacy regime. I'm talking about national. Internationally, they don't have any legislation to regulate that. But in the national context, it's, I think, from my knowledge, the only country that allows commercial surrogacy in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to the sale of a child. Because what happens is the surrogate mother receives all the payments for the surrogacy arrangement, which are confirmed by the court beforehand. And then she has a cooling off period. I don't remember whether it's 7 days, whether it's 14 days, but she has an opportunity to keep the child. And so then when she eventually decides to transfer the child to the intending parents, she's not doing it because of money. She's received the money. She can keep the money if she decides to keep the child. And because Israel has this fantastic system where the state social workers really work with the surrogate mothers in working out their motivations, and works with the intending parents, and works with the different parties all together at the same time, even with the extended family. From our last meeting with them, they've explained to me that they've never had a breakdown in the relationship. The surrogate mother has always chosen to hand over the child to the intending parents as it was initially intended. And so I think that that's a practice that we can learn from. But maybe Geraldine wants to say something.
Oh, go ahead, Geraldine.
No, I have some consideration. It is true that when you have the name of the surrogate on the birth certificate, there is a guarantee that the child will be able to know this mother. But and it's also for me a procedure with much more respectful of the best interest of the child, because I think it's important also to check finally, but it can be a procedure that will take place before. So as Mia, I don't think there is something would be preferable, but I just will, if you don't mind, Sally, I will just quickly respond to one or two questions that are raised. So I will try to do my best. So I will answer to Donrich Talder. So Donrich Talder, I think perhaps we don't agree on one point, but I think from my point of view that Article 7 of the Convention of the Children's Rights guarantee the child's right to know all the parents, not only social and legal parents, but also genetical parents. And in the you can see in the observation to the concluding observation on several states, the Committee on the Rights of the Child says that states that allows anonymous childbirth, secrecy of adoption, but also, I said it, anonymity of gamete or embryo donation, does not respect the child's rights to know also his or her genetic parents. Mia, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think it's the interpretation of the committee.
It's definitely the committee has come up in one of its general comments on the definition of family, and it's a very broad definition. It includes social family, legal family, those that are genetically linked. And I think we fall on dangerous ground if we're now in a society where we say it's only heterosexual families, mother, father, that are going to be considered the family. So I think it's important, if we're considering it from the perspective of the child, that they have the opportunity to know as wide as possible, whoever their family is, to them. And it's for the child to define, and it's like in Indigenous groups. Indigenous groups don't just say mother and my biological mother and father and my father. They say aunts, uncles, grandparents. That's who my family is to me. And I think that that's the way the Committee on the Rights of the Child is going with that. And maybe if I could just add this very quick explanation of Article 8 of the Convention. When they drafted Article 8 of the Convention, it was actually because of the dictatorship in Argentina. And it was the grandmothers there that came to Geneva to fight to have this right to identity in family relations. So it wasn't just the mother and the father, it was wider family. And so then based on that, you can really, the spirit of the text is to include genetics. And I hope that it's not an obsession, Donrick, but it's really basically going with the interpretation of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, with UNICEF, with the UN, to say, let's interpret family very broadly for the perspective of the child.
Yes, and I just want to add, knowing one's origins does not mean that you will have a legal link of filiation. That's two things that can be totally different. I think the children need both. They need to know where they come from, but it doesn't mean they will change their parents from a legal point of view. So it's very important to understand the difference. And just one thing, and after promise, I give the floor to Lottie Park-Morton. Yes, I totally agree with you, because the judgments of the Strasbourg Court in Paradiso and Valdis Fjöl-Nisdottir is quite strange, because in fact, in the advisory opinion, they stress to the importance to permit creation of a legal link between the intended mothers, whether she's the genetic mother or not. So it's very strange that the other judgments, because there are no biological links, they refuse the recognition of a link between the child and the parent. They only say in Valdis that it was a famille d'accueil. Can you say that?
Foster family.
Yes, that it was sufficient, but I don't totally agree with their two judgments that Lottie mentioned, and I understand the question.
So as I understand it, just to briefly sort of sum up what we've been discussing, is there's this question of whether or not the right to know one's origins pertains to genetics, to one's genetic links, and or the wider social and family links. And it seems like Donric has some concern that a recognition of those genetic links may in some way undermine certain bonds that a child may have with their social or wider family, but it seems like the panelists don't agree with that perspective. I just wanted to pick up on another really important question that occurred to me off the back of your presentation, Sharon. We've got a really interesting question from Jessica Chavez about some parallels between research on the environment for the fetus in utero with a surrogate, and how similar discourses have been used by the far right in the US concerning abortion rights. Whilst there's obviously many legitimate reasons to do research on these effects in utero, is there some concern that there's this sort of degree of additional scrutiny that surrogates are subject to, that children born via other arrangements or people who are bearing children in other ways aren't? Is there some concern that that can be an oppressive force or can be misused in certain ways politically? And I guess also related, Jessica, as a sort of secondary question to this, was interested in the panel's views on abortion rights for surrogates as well.
I mean, I suppose many things can be misused and taken into a context in which they were not intended. I think it's really interesting to think of the experience of the baby, and obviously the baby who grows up to be an adult, and I think any research which helps us to think more carefully and to then practice more sensitively in any complex arrangement around conception is a positive step forward. And I think that in relation to all those parties, but particularly and emphasizing that of the child, who is the only person who doesn't consent to join into that and lives with this story for the rest of their lives. My experience is that in families that are open, whether it's about surrogacy or donor conception, and who have therefore worked through any feelings that they have about infertility, about the difficulty of carrying a baby, of the issues around anonymity, if that's what they have had to do, and then carry that into their relationships with their children and supporting their children to understand. And I have met many hundreds of families like that. They are generally the most emotionally literate, thoughtful, self-reflecting people that I know, who produce resilient, strong, proud children and young adults. And I don't think it weakens family relationships whatsoever. What does weaken them very often is a secret which is expressed in some way through disconnections or lack of closeness, or secrets that come out very late. And one of the things that we have to think about everywhere now is that the context of secrecy and anonymity doesn't exist. Well, the context of anonymity really doesn't exist anymore since the advent of over-the-counter DNA testing and the increase in the number of people taking that up. That is sadly a way in which many people find out things about biological relationships that they never had any idea of. And I think that for that reason alone, one should be thinking that children need to have a way of finding out anyway. And I think it's much better to find out within the family and to support and help parents be open and honest with their children about that. Children can manage all these things perfectly well, A, if their parents do, and B, if they're supported to do it. I know some families where late telling has been a bombshell and resulted in enormous pain and difficulties, and others where it's been weathered, and if anything, you know, in time has strengthened the family. And but there is no doubt that, you know, there are feelings about not being told or being felt, you know. And I appreciate that some people in the chat have been saying, you know, why this focus? And I would say, if you were donor conceived and you found out at your age now, how would you feel? And, you know, whenever I do teaching on this subject, I always say to people, everybody in this room could be donor conceived. Maybe not surrogacy born, but could be donor conceived through sperm donation, which has been going on for more decades than most people realise.
No, look, it's very interesting, and I mean, I think what you're suggesting is in a way that, regardless of what the substantive arrangements are, what's very important for children's well-being is transparency, managed sensitively, and for all of those actors in the network to sort of be on board with how they're approaching it. I'm just conscious that we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I did want to take this opportunity to ask Mia, who I know has been working very closely in relation to the situation in Ukraine, how the conflict in Ukraine has brought to light the shortcomings in the international conventions governing surrogacy, the need for reform in certain areas. What lessons have we learned from that, and what are the areas that deserve our most urgent attention in relation to the well-being of surrogates, children, and intended parents?
Okay, thanks, Sally. I don't know if I'm working very, very closely, but I'm working on that issue in Ukraine, and it has come up, and I think that it shows really the need for the lack of international regulation, and the lack of international guidance is really missing. So people are saying, what do I do? How do I contact the child? How do I get into a country that's involved in a conflict? And here we have, you know, I don't know, that dozens of children being born and then not being able to, their lives being at risk. The surrogate mother is not the legal mother of the children in Ukraine. It's going to be the intending parents, but many of the intending parents come from countries that don't allow surrogacy, so they're not going to be necessarily the legal parents either. So then in what we call is limping parentage, these children will not have a parent necessarily, or not in the immediate future. So what we're trying to work on and trying to encourage is that, firstly, focus on survival needs of these children, because that's their most pressing need, is to maybe to evacuate them, and then in a second stage, then work on who is the legal parent of these children. But for us, in working out the legal parentage of these children, this would be a best interest assessment, but you would also then take into account at a later stage, what would the children think if they found out that they were born through a surrogacy arrangement that occurred in Ukraine, which allows for commercial surrogacy, which, according to international law, mostly results in the sale of children. So how will a person, when they're an adult, feel that they were placed with intending parents that were involved in child selling? So these are questions that have to be asked. And I think it will depend. Like in some cases, the child may not be placed with the intending parents because the degree of involvement in the sale of this child or the buying of this child was so grave that the children should not be placed with them. Just like in any other, like if I was involved in child selling, I'm sure that my children would be taken away from me. So just like in any other child protection matter. But then in other cases, maybe the children will be placed with them. But I think the courts will have to factor in not just the short-term interest, that the children are well protected now, they've got a home now, but what will they think in 20 years' time? Because what I can see from an inter-country adoption, these children that were born through illegal adoptions, they're not saying thank you that I was placed with adoptive parents irrespective of what occurred. Then there's a whole cohort of very angry inter-country adoptees. And I think we need to learn from those lessons. And that's what we hope will happen in Ukraine. And if I can finish with this, it's not enough to now say, let's call for a moratorium on surrogacy. That's not the response, because the system was already very weak beforehand. Already in Ukraine, the surrogate mother did not have a thinking period. She never had an opportunity to reconsider whether she could have the child or not. And her payment was really only when she physically transferred the child to the intending parents would she be paid. So if she went through the pregnancy and at 8 months the child died, she was not getting any, she would only get half the payment. So here you can see that the full payment is really for the transfer. So there is really sale here. And I think that that's something that the international community has to now look at and say, are we going to allow this practice under this way? If we are going to allow surrogacy, then at least let's make sure that every single right in the Convention of the Rights of the Child is respected. I think that that's what we have to push for now as a result of Ukraine.
But off the back of this, I mean, based on what Geraldine was saying, is that there are situations where it's almost impossible to balance every single right at the same time, and that there are sort of trade-offs that need to be made against
Absolutely.
both between rights for the child, but also between the child's rights and other rights. Is there any jurisprudence or other principles within international law that provide that kind of meta principle about how those rights ought to be balanced? It seemed, based on what you were saying, that the principle that perhaps you favour is what would the child as an adult then later be able to endorse and feel psychologically content with. I'm just curious as to whether there's precedent or there's an emerging consensus about what that principle that guides the balancing of rights for children and others who are involved in surrogacy arrangements ought to be.
The only thing we have at the moment is what's called the best interests of the child, and this would be an individual assessment. So it's not, we can't say that generally for all children surrogacy is a good thing. We can only look at an individual case and say, okay, looking at this specific case and all the different factors of this specific case, it would be in the best interest of the child, either A, to be placed with the intending parents, or B, to be placed in a foster family, or C, to be placed in another setting. But that's the only guiding light that we have that we can do, and it really has to be an individual assessment. I don't think we can say categorically the child has to always be placed with intending parents, or categorically always has to be removed from them when there's sale. And that's, I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out, but that's what we're using, and that's what is being used at the moment.
There's so many more threads I'd love to pick up, but we are coming to the end of our time. Before we wrapped up, I just wanted to see Geraldine or Sharon or Mia as well, if you had any concluding remarks about the conversation that you'd like to share.
I think it could go on a lot longer. And there've been some really interesting points made, which I think just remind us all that this is an enormously complex level, which is extremely interdisciplinary. It's not only, we haven't even talked about the people who are operating in clinics and how they practice. But I think we are collectively, and I think this is really time, it's been a long time coming, really thinking and understanding more about what young people and adults think about having been created in some of these ways. And we have to listen to the multitude of voices. There are angry people, there are happy people, it's not as simple as that, but we have to think about what we learn from that and how that feeds back into how we do what we do and what we allow and how we support people.
Thank you, Sharon. Geraldine, I sense you wanted to jump in there.
I can tell it in French. No, you prefer it? I will try in English, but I wanted to say, I didn't say that genetic parents were everything. I just say that a child needs both, because he needs the intended parents because they chose to have this child, but he also has the right to know where it comes from. And I think Sharon told we have to listen to the children and the adults. That's what we did in the context of adoption and international adoption. And these adults told that it was important for them to know. So I think now we have to listen to children, donor conceived, well, that's what I wanted to say, because that's a fundamental right too. So, well, yes. Thank you, Sally and everybody. It was very, very interesting. I'm so sorry it's not in French, because I had a lot of things to tell, but I try to do my best.
You've been perfectly eloquent and illuminating, so please don't worry about that in the slightest, Geraldine. And I think where this leaves us really comes back to Sharon's call for more research, that this is an area where there's a dearth of understanding of the diversity of experiences of everybody involved, and that there's the grave necessity for that to be rectified. So I really appreciate everyone's participation, both the panelists and also the participants. I believe that the presentations that Geraldine and Sharon gave will also be available. So if you would like to contact the Brochure Foundation, they'll be able to distribute those. And we look forward to seeing you at further meetups. And thanks once again, everybody, for your time. It's been a real pleasure for me. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.